And welcome to the Yamhill County Historical Society. This is our quarterly program. We call it Secrets of the Past. Thus we do them quarterly. And these are put together by our Activities and Events Committee. My name is Dave Rucker and I'm on that committee and happy to have you all here. Tonight's program, just in time for All Hallows Eve, is called Spooks to Spirits, Tales of History and Mystery in Yamhill County. Ooh. There are snacks and beverages over at these tables. Help yourself throughout the evening. And our agenda for tonight, here's the part we weren't expecting. One of our speakers, Tracy Ward, is not here tonight. She has the flu. Feel bad for her though as well. The flu stinks, especially this time of the year. However, following Hallows Eve, she's here in spirit because we're going to show a film based on her book, Spooks to Spirits. So we're going to show that first. And what also this means, the part I like, that means we get a double dose of Kory Knutz. Kory, yes. Kory's the board member and also one of our caretakers at the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. So he's going to talk a lot about that as well. So it's still going to be a fabulous night, I believe. We'll go through the video. Kory's presentation, there'll be a section at the end for questions and answers, I'll bet. Yes, we'll snack like crazy, we'll drink wine like crazy. And go on from there. And if you wouldn't mind silencing your cell phone, that would be awesome. Thank you very much. Are we ready to roll the film? Let her rip. We'll dim the lights a bit.
You and I should hear this throughout more memory. It's really short. Because we come there every day. But I want to do there.
The story you are about to hear is arguably the most famous and frightening. The Curse of Lafayette. Is it a witch or is it a gypsy? This is a true story. Although many are convinced it's a witch, I believe that title would suffice for whoever experienced her wrath. Perhaps that is the answer to the confusion over witch or gypsy. There are many documented accounts of the story that you are about to hear. This tale would become part of Oregon history and be included in a book titled The Necktie Parties. These necktie parties were legal executions that were carried out between 1851 and 1905. On April 9, 1887, at 11 a.m., a sharp crack of the gavel disrupted the collective. Did not relate to the sentence of death by hanging, but instead the last statement of the judge, "And may God have mercy on your soul." All watching felt Richard Marple should not be given any opportunity to save his soul because his crimes were too heinous. Richard Marple, his wife Julia, and mother Anna had moved to Lafayette little more than a year before. Richard, or Gus as he was known, was not a man who could hold a job or do an honest day's work. He was suspected of a number of robberies that had been committed throughout the county, but with no proof, no arrest could be made. Not well liked or trusted, this family, despite the rumors, maintained residence in Lafayette. His mother Anna was no better. She was smart and conniving, holding small jobs herself. She was older, but still had her looks and used them to beguile her unsuspecting victims. In Lafayette, there lived a well-respected and well-liked 56-year-old carpenter and shopkeeper. His name was David Corker. He was quite successful, single, and rich. This did not go unnoticed by Anna Marple, who set her sights on Corker. Anna and Corker would soon begin a lurid affair. Anna had set in motion a plan that would soon change everyone's lives forever. This plan would ultimately result in placing Anna and her son Richard in the history and mystery of Oregon, and her story, in some form or another, is still told today. We can't know the date Anna Marple and her son Richard conceived their plan to rob her new conquest, David Corker. Richard and his mother decided that she would give Corker a sleeping powder. Richard thought himself to be knowledgeable in the use of drugs. His mother would put the sleeping drug in Corker's drink. When it took effect, Richard would enter the store through the back door. Simple. All the pieces were in place, and Anna had successfully given the drug to Corker. After waiting for the drug to take effect, Anna would get him to the bedroom. Marple tried to enter the back door, but his mother had forgotten to unlock it. He then went to a side window and found it open and entered into the store. All this noise started to rouse Corker. Corker had heard Richard come in. The drug was already wearing off.
Oh my goodness.
Anna then realized that she would be the prime suspect for the robbery. At this point, Richard suggested they kill Corker and burn the building. Anna quickly found an axe and struck Corker on the forehead with a glancing blow, which only seemed to wake him. Corker is now alert. Richard grabbed the axe from his mother and started hacking away at Corker, knocking him to the bed. Corker laid in an awkward position for left-handed Richard. It was hard to get in a good blow. It took many strikes to finish the job. Blood splattered everywhere. Richard finally got in a killing blow. Gruesomely chopped about the face and head, Corker would die slowly.
Oh,
The Marples didn't set the building on fire, but instead arranged the body to look as if it was some kind of ritualistic killing, possibly by someone in the Masonic order. They got away with $203. Strange noises had been heard by two teenagers passing by. The boys ran for the sheriff. Richard and his mother quickly crawled out the side window to escape. Anna and Richard didn't think about the amount of blood in the room. Richard walked through it as he left the scene. They had planned to leave that night, but decided to stay another day to throw off suspicion. A crowd gathered outside Corker's store to see what had happened. Among them, Richard Marple, joining the curious and horrified crowd as a diversion. Anna and Richard would be arrested that next day. The sheriff had followed bloody footprints that he had found. They led straight to the Marple house. There, he also discovered a bloody coat. Marple explained that the blood was from a hog's head he was bringing home to feed his family. Of course, he couldn't produce the hog's head, and no one would believe his story. Anna Marple was released after several weeks from the Yamhill County Jail, where she and her son were being held together. They didn't have enough evidence to keep her. Marple was cocky and denied any involvement. Marple would then say he was framed by the detective, who Marple claimed took his coat to Corker's and dipped it in his blood. He would claim to be innocent to the very end. Marple awaited his trial. The judge trying his case was Judge Reuben Boise, a judge well respected by the bar and the public for the painstaking way in which he considered each case. He would spend hours of contemplation and research in and out of the courtroom. He'd earned a reputation as a patient and meticulous judge, displaying intelligence and legal insight. In my research, I came across a story in which the judge had watched 8 men die after he had passed their death sentences. But in all the other accounts I've read, I could find only 2 cases that resulted in death sentences, and Marple makes 3. The day of the sentencing, Marple, being found guilty, would yell at the judge saying, "You are about to sentence an innocent man, and someday you will regret it." Judge Boise pronounced the verdict.
It is a sentence of this court that you be taken from hence and confined in a county jail until the 29th day of May, 1887. And upon said day, between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., that you be taken from said jail to the place of execution. And in accordance with this judgment, you'll be hanged by the neck if you are dead. And may God have mercy.
The crack of the gavel resounded in the courtroom. Marple removed as he angrily professed his innocence. Yet
You be
again,
dead innocent man to the judge.
the hanging day, it dawned bright and cold. The town was filled with spectators wanting to see this murderer hanged for his crimes. Marple had a drink of whiskey laced with opiates and refused to dress himself in the execution clothes. The sheriff had to do the disagreeable duty. Marple commented that these were the nicest clothes he had worn in 10 years. Marple marched from his cell to the scaffolding, passing the waiting coffin. The death warrant was read to the crowd. Marple interrupted, "False as hell." The noose was placed around his neck. In the last few seconds before he was dropped, Marple would turn his head and the knot in the rope would slip. Instead of a swift death from a broken neck, he was strangled slowly and painfully. Marple would take 18 minutes to die. His wife and mother watched in horror. Falling to her knees in despair as she watched, she then gained some composure and began to curse the town of Lafayette. Her son still gasped for his last breath.
Oh. Down will burn 3 times. You all.
Fear into the hearts of all those who watched this hanging, curse that she spat out. No one would be able to forget the events of that day. What was to follow will be met with disbelief and become part of the history and mystery of Yamhill County forever, as the curse of Lafayette continues. You're probably wondering how I can tell you with such detail the story of the murder. Well, Marple's cellmate would tell this story after Marple's hanging. Anna Marple and Julia had already moved from town not to be found. Anna, who promised Julia half of the stolen money, would never make good on that promise. Julia and her kids would disappear from history. Anna moved from town, but her curse remained. Lafayette would suffer. This once thriving city would soon fall as the curse seemed to take hold. The Yamhill River, that had been a constant source of revenue for Lafayette, started to dry up, creating mishaps for both steamers and traders. The river would soon become too narrow to navigate. Then smallpox would come, killing an unknown number of residents. There was little doubt Lafayette was losing its stronghold. This created an opportunity for McMinnville to win the vote and capture the county seat. This would happen the year of Marple's execution. In 1890, locks were built in the Yamhill River to help continue water trade, but it would be too little, too late. McMinnville had already acquired the railroad, which made the water lines obsolete. Lafayette was on a downward spiral. The Athens of Oregon was no more. Lafayette would then burn in 1904, destroying nearly all of the city. 19 buildings, including the fire hall, would be left in ashes. Lafayette rebuilt, only to burn again in 1934. From my calculation, either there is one more fire coming, or Let's hope Lafayette has dodged a bullet. And the fire 40 years before could be counted as 3. All in all, a massive exodus and fall from power would leave Lafayette struggling to survive. Not elsewhere. Spirit may have come back, perhaps to see her curse unfold. It is believed she is still at the cemetery where her son's unmarked grave lies. Reports of a dark spirit lurking there is widespread. As he sat by the road near the cemetery, he saw a dark figure, 8 to 10 feet in height. It ran 40 yards from one tree to another. The figure wasn't solid and moved very quickly, like he did to get out of there. I heard a story of a dad taking his little boy who was scared of ghosts to the graveyard. He brought friends, chairs, and hot chocolate. They settled in to prove a point. Screams, the mother and friends ran, leaving the young boy. Something is out there. A number of people tell me they have experienced the blood-curdling scream. A sense of whipping. A horrifying specter that actually causes physical damage, like cutting intruders with a razor blade. I myself harm. The graveyard is a protected historic property. I can't give you an address, but it sits in a quiet area of Lafayette, unsettled to this day by a dark energy that will make itself known anytime.
That's the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. And the Holy Church as well, I saw it there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will bring up my THS board member, and a guy who mows that very cemetery, Kory Knutz.
This person is
Yeah.
Have a little more volume of this. Okay. Dancing around. Well, good evening. Well, all the disclaimers, I had about a couple hours to prepare today. You know, if there's a curse with that cemetery, I think it's on lawnmowers, because I mowed it today, and the second time in a row, my machine broke down, and well, we got out of there. But you know, I'm probably the Ebenezer Scrooge of, you know, embellishing ghost stories. I'm just sorry to disappoint you. But it was interesting to watch that. You know, it talks about the town burning, you know, twice or maybe 3 times, counting the one from 40 years before. But to totally throw water on that fire. Most of the towns around the county, most of them burned down at one point or another. And McMinnville was really the best at not burning due to the fact that we had a lot more brick buildings by the late 1880s and 90s. But more so, we had constant pressure hydrants all throughout the downtown district where you could roll a hose cart up and start dispensing water that was pumped off of the Yamhill River. That was a godsend. And towns like Sheridan burnt in the teens, Dayton burnt. So I don't, you know, of course, I'm just totally downplaying that. But so, and I was mowing the cemetery today, and we have this new beautiful gate, and my lawnmower actually even fits underneath that gate. If I put the roll bar down, it's kind of handy. But Dean Moxley here, that's in the crowd, he built that gate for us, and I'm going to have to read a lot of notes tonight because you know, it's my job that nobody gets any good rest in the next hour. But and I hope you don't. Let's make a room here. Get your glasses. Okay. Yeah, so Dean, we had him build it and he volunteered his time to design and craft this new entrance gate. And to those who helped install it, and to them, well, thanks to all those who did that. Next slide is, I think, the side gate. So you can enter from the side. We had kind of just a piece of angle iron gate across there for years and years and years. And this is quite the upgrade. And it just looks beautiful. Also, thanks to Emily Gladhart for starting development of the native plant garden that will attract the pollinators, you know, bees and stuff. And the new habitat is located inside of these curbs. And it's protected from people like me with a lawnmower. And so that stands a better chance of growing to full maturity. So it'll take a few years for the plants to take root and get going. And so thanks to them and the Winters Hills Estate Vineyard that were awarded the flagship farm award for the Oregon Bee Project. So some collaboration there to make that happen. And then last spring, the society received a $2,000 grant from the Oregon Commission of Historic Cemeteries to restore the first 12 gravestones in dire need of repair. Historic Preservation Northwest with David Pinyard at the and is doing the restoration work. This is the before picture of the stone before Jemima Cooper, we're going to talk about in a little bit. It was laying on the ground, so they righted it and put it back together. And I think the next picture probably shows us some of that progress, which is pretty cool, because as you're up there mowing, sometimes there's still a lot of stones still laying on the ground. And a lot of times what happens is moles and gophers, they'll basically take the grade underneath the stone and start undermining it. And all of a sudden they start tipping, or you just have some idiot people up there knocking them down on a certain night. You know, that happens to vandals. But it's quite the process to get them righted and put back together. Unusual for the times, Bob Hussey, son of a slave woman, was buried in the Carey family plot. Miles and Cyrene Carey came to the Oregon on the first wagon train in 1843. Bob's mother was meant to stay behind, but she was determined to join the Carey family in Oregon. Also, is the Lafayette and the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery contains a heritage tree in the southeast corner, spreading its branches over the Carey plot. It's a native Oregon white oak. It says 47 feet high. I think this is some old information. It's a little taller than 47 feet at this point, but it's a beautiful tree with really wide arcing limbs and 4 feet in diameter and over 200 years old. Many graves have no markers, but one grave has a marker and no body. Matthew Harbison died in the Civil War in 1863 and lies in an unknown grave in the National Cemetery in Memphis. His wife Mary had come across the plains to Oregon as a widow, but buried his spirit with her. Several stones represent our veterans in the different wars. John Bird, Black Hawk, and the Cayuse Indian Wars. Yamhill County Treasurer 3 terms, beginning in 1870, had a hardware store in Lafayette. George Samuel Green was in the Civil War in Ohio. We got Matthew Harbison, Civil War in Tennessee. Archie Morgan, World War I. And then his brother Fred Morgan as well. Josiah Conley Nelson, the Cayuse Indian War, and pioneer in 1844, state legislature. U.S. Navy Captain Colin Williams, nursing corps. You hear me reference the Cayuse Indian War, and that was something that took place after the Whitman massacre up in East Washington. So the Whitmans had the mission, and they're out here first. In fact, before the 1843, when the wagon train started picking up, and it was, you know, that manifest destiny, move west and be a pioneer, and there wasn't even a thought of being able to claim land per se, because that was yet to happen a few years later. But before, you know, the pioneers moved out here, there was missionaries out here ministering to the natives, and there was a lot of obviously there's a lot of communication struggles, and even trying to communicate what you're trying to articulate, which led to a lot of misunderstandings, and unfortunately, if I remember right, I think there was about, 47 people were killed. At the Whitman massacre. Somebody probably knows the right number. Somebody raise their hand out there? No, okay. So at least, now back to the deal here, there's at least 28 children, there's 28 children account for the 105 graves in the cemetery. These 4 baby gravestones were remade by volunteers. And we've got the names here. It's from 1910. It's baby boy. I'm just gonna try to ruin these names if I try to say them all. But it's there was a lot of children died in birth. You know, we didn't have any medical technology out here much to brag about, and things were pretty primitive on the frontier. Now, this Johnson lady, 1875-1907, has a poem for us on her stones epitaph. Remember, friend, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and eternity. You know, I don't know if you've ever, sometimes my wife and I will walk through a cemetery, and it is quite humbling when you look at a date and a dash and you think about an entire life lived, and yet here you're just looking at 2 numbers. I don't know, it's humbling. It's makes you think about our, you know, we are like flowers in the field that sprout for a while and then we fade away. How's that for some encouragement for you? And it's just not getting any better. A life cut short. This is Pamela Jane Baker, 1884 to 1907. Miss Baker, she was a teacher and she died of pneumonia at age 23. And that is up in the, you can see the wrought iron fence around that area. And that's up there in the Pioneer Cemetery, of course. There's 2 ghost stories common in Yamhill County, both came from the wineries. Lena Elsie Imus is buried in Dundee, where her parents ran the post office. Lena was attending Portland Business College when in 1907, her father died and she returned home to help her mother. The Newberg graphic states that she was despondent and drank a toxic liquid, causing her death at age 23. And so Argyle Winery uses the old Imus Homestead City Hall as their aptly named spirit house. Lena makes herself known with a strong perfume and a couple of antics. Once a glass slid down the bar on its own, and another time a copy machine repair person watched his toolbox levitate and dumped the contents on its own. They left out the part where he had like 7 glasses of wine. Just embellishing it a little further, why not? The Bayless family plot. This is the only one that's up there in the cemetery that's just totally covered with I think there we go, it's kind of cutting out, but it's the only plot up there that's completely covered with a concrete slab. In 1906, when brothers Daniel and Samuel Bayless purchased 234 acres of what is now known as Ghost Hill cellars, earlier settlers related a legend, which is the story behind the current winery's name. The Bayless family lived with this ghost, and perhaps he followed them to their graves there at the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. And I think I have more of a story that goes with this than in my notes. Bear with me as I go through these papers here, because I don't want to miss that. There's also, Karen, did you see, did I ever go past the Jemima? You know, I won't go back to there was a picture of a gravestone. It's one of the first ones I talked about where they had up, you know, put the gravestone upright. And she has quite a colorful story, which I do want to tell. And so instead of going back and looking for the gravestone, you just have to listen to me talk about it. So the colorful life of Jemima Perryman Champion, Burton Clayton Cooper. That's the full name. She was married a few times, and that's kind of what makes the story a little bit colorful. The most dynamic woman found in the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. would have to be Jemima Perryman Champion Burton Clayton Cooper, born in Devonshire, England in 1782. Her mother died when she was 3, and she was raised by a wealthy father, but disowned for eloping with John Burton at age 17. Apparently, the family wanted her to marry a cousin, which would keep the money in the family. Well, John Burton was captured in the Napoleonic Wars, but Jemima hurried to Paris to negotiate his release. Under French law, a relative could not represent him, so she got a French divorce. Determined to see Napoleon, she brushed past his guards, and Napoleon was impressed by her audacity. He said he couldn't release John, but he hinted that you should be cheap at a certain place at a certain time. Let's see here. At a certain place at a certain time. And when she got there, shots were fired for show, and John was permitted to escape. Perhaps she needed money for that adventure since she was charged with forgery on notes on the 12th of August in 1820 and sentenced to 14 years' time. Well, John Burton, trying to see here, he, now a captain on the sailing brig Plymouth, came down with yellow fever on one trip. The crew put in at the port in Havana, Cuba, and raised the yellow warning flag. All but one on the ship died, and the authorities towed the brig with the dead crew in the bunks out to sea and sunk it. So there went Burton. The year after her husband died, Jemima was shipped off on the convict ship called Mary Ann to Australia. She disembarked on June 5th, 1822 in Hobart, Tasmania, with her 2 children, John and Sarah Burton. Jemima was married the second time to fellow convict from England, John Clayton. They had a daughter together, Zilda Perryman Clayton, in 1823, and sadly, John. What are you guessing? I can die, right? He was executed. He was executed on July 7th, 1827 in Tasmania, having been charged with stealing sheep. Pretty high penalty, right? So 4 years later, Jemima was married once more to Henry Cooper, a charming Irishman, and together they adopted a local boy named Thomas Brown. Then in 1844, Jemima and Henry Cooper decided to sail on a ship with a final destination of Astoria, Oregon. Then waited in Hawaii for her son, John James Burton, and his wife sailing on the Heber, or Heber, either way. The ship was becalmed, which means there just wasn't enough wind. And so they were stalled quite a while, 8 months, just to reach Hawaii. So can you imagine having a layover for 8 months in Hawaii? Just terrible, but they made do. And so after they met up, then they went the rest of the journey, and they, with Captain Cooch, which is a Portland name that we know, and a lot of times we say couch. So I'm probably going to say it wrong, but they took only 22 days, and they traveled overland to Portland, where the oldest son, John James Burton, decided to stay, and he built an early hotel called the Burton House. So to end it out here, Jemima and Henry looked for land to raise sheep and settled in North Fork, Yamhill County, where they took up a donation land claim. She was an active businesswoman, obtaining property in several counties in Oregon. She was remembered as a colorful lady riding her horse named Mouse, as she checked on her holdings. Jemima died December 17th, 1862. And according to her granddaughter, Jemima's long funeral procession of wagons, buggies, and those on horseback traveled 15 miles through rain and sleet on an appalling roads to the cemetery. And so here we see today, when you're at the cemetery, and of course, we're not looking at the right slide at the moment, but as soon as you go through that beautiful new gate that we have there, it's just on the right in a row. There's several stones that were righted right there. And here's a pretty colorful story to tell you about Joel Perkins. He came over, one of the early settlers, 1843, over the wagon train, at the age of 23, with his mom and his dad. He also had some brothers, I believe, but eventually he married Laura Hahn, which we also know that derives from the county road we know as Honda Creek Road. Honda Creek Road's just between Lafayette, McMinnville, kind of out from the Kubota tractor dealership. So her dad was Jacob Hahn, and Jacob Hahn was a millwright. And he came over the Oregon Trail during the same time with some of the first trains in 1843, and consequently he lost a lot of his tools on a wagon that tipped over in Unity, Oregon area in the Powder River. They got them together, enough tools together, and he was able to build 13 different grist mills around the Willamette Valley, anywhere from Polk County, Yamhill County. He helped build the grist mill here in McMinnville, 1853 for William Newby. So there's some of the family background. It was a very respected family, the Hahns. And so at the age of 14, Laura marries Joel Perkins in 1850. And in 1850, well, I think he was about 34 years old, and and I could have that date slightly embellished or wrong, but there was quite an age gap, but however, quite common. And as you read the history on this, I kind of have to chuckle, because the first thing that was noted after he married Laura Hahn was he could claim 320 more acres because he was married. And that was part of the land claim deeds. And I always kind of make that joke. A lot of single men coming over the wagon train got married, you know, on the wagon train or on the process. And when they got here, they could claim 640 acres, which is double from 320. And so, you know, true love, right? And so one interesting thing about Joel Perkins was, well, for starters, he platted and he set out Lafayette, the very town site, in 1847. So, you know, before that time, there was no Lafayette. It was just an idea of this guy, Joel. He lays out the town site, and strategically so. The Yamhill River had a shallow spot in the river at the end of the Bridge Street. So when you're coming into Lafayette from McMinnville and you see Bill's Market on the right, kind of a barn-shaped, very old building, but the name of the street is called Bridge Street. I gotta get some water here. Ooh. It's called Bridge Street, and you go, where's the bridge, right? Well, the bridge existed for about 4 or 5 years. Just a couple of blocks over those railroad tracks that did not exist back then either. And basically Lafayette just took off about 1850, 1851 because of the gold rush. And you go, there's no gold in Yamhill County, you know. Well, there really is not much in Yamhill County. But if you were an informed traveler, say you're even coming from Chehalis or Tacoma, and you hear that, oh my gosh, in this 1849, the 49ers, the gold rush, all this excitement, gold fever, people would travel several states to go down there and see, you know, try their hand at getting some gold. And one such individual that actually was quite successful in getting some gold was actually Samuel Cosine. And today we still have the Cosine house just across the street from First Federal. He was a blacksmith, but he made his money going down to the gold rush, or, you know, he found a bunch of gold, made it back, didn't get killed, didn't get robbed. And I think it was about $6,000, which was a pile of money back in those days. So you could probably times that times 400% to figure out what inflation is for today, what that money would actually be worth, that gold would be worth today. So a little sidetrack, but we are trying to talk about Joel Perkins. And so he lays out the town site Lafayette, and it starts taking off because of the gold rush. Because if you were an informed traveler, that's what I was about to say. If you knew where you're going and how to get there, you came down the west side of the Willamette River, and that would take you through Lafayette. If you didn't know any better, you would go over by Oregon City and that's Kanawha and all those old towns, Canby, that didn't even exist much back then. Terrible way to go, terrible. There's all, if you're ever over there, you see all the rocky canyons and ridges. How in the world do you even get, you can't pull a wagon through most of that area. A lot of the roads were not even existing yet, but there was very in the early times. So we're saying 1843, 1850s, there's some natives, you know, they call them Indian trails that went through the areas. So those became the most highly traveled areas if it was not too muddy. So Lafayette starts blooming and taking off. And really, the heyday of Lafayette was about 1854, 1855. I know the movies makes it sound like it was just had all this hope and it was just bustling and going. But it was very noted that shortly after the gold rush waned, people just weren't going through Lafayette. Lafayette also didn't get the railroad because it just wasn't a good place to make a railroad. So that's really where the railroads went. They went where the path of least resistance. And McMinnville was not the path of least resistance. Yet, well, we have a railroad here. And as we've discussed in previous presentations, that's because McMinnville fronted $100,000, tons of effort, labor, materials, and we had to build 2 or 3 extra trestles just to make McMinnville have railroad. In fact, 3/4 mile of railroad was pulled up over by St. Joseph. St. Joseph is in that same area we're talking about, Pond Creek Road, and Capital Honda. The railroad it was going to go over the Yamhill River south of there and go over the grade would have went over the airport in McMinnville. Well, that never happened because they never crossed the river there. Instead, they pulled it up and they ran it through McMinnville because money talks. And as Lafayette was kind of descending into not successful, it kind of became an ingrained town where they didn't even want a bank. And it sounds crazy. You would think, how could they not want a bank? You know, that would be so convenient to write somebody a check, go over into town, Lafayette, and cash it. But instead, you would have to go clear to Oregon City. And so they turned down the bank option because they were making bank. The storekeepers in town were making a lot of money off of the county employees too. They would come cash their check and they would add 20% to the check and they'd go, God, I have to go all the way to Oregon City. I gotta ride a horse out there. It's gonna take me all day. Then I gotta stay the night. I gotta eat dinner. I gotta eat breakfast, and I have to ride all the way back the next day just to cash your check. So 20% more. Well, they get a fistful of checks and they get 20% profit on top of the profit they're already making. So why would they want to have a bank come into town? So they didn't. And so they told basically the workmen to go pound sand. So the workmen leave all disgruntled and disheartened. And some McMinnville folk caught up with them and said, hey, come build a bank in McMinnville. And so 1883, we have the first bank in Yamhill County in McMinnville. Just a few years later, between 1883 and 1888, when we get the county seat, was that story of the Marple story and the curse of Lafayette, right? Well, you can see right now, McMinnville's already prospering pretty darn well. In fact, a year later, they said, we got the county seat, and then railroad came in 1889. And so McMinnville's just taken off. Lafayette is shrinking. And up until about, what was it? Lafayette in recent years, in the last 10 or 15 years, was actually the fastest growing community in the state of Oregon. If you doubt that, go drive out on north of town. That town just keeps going and going at this point. So the demise of, this is the juicy story. How did Joel Perkins die? Well, he could have lived a lot longer had he not had a rough marriage of some sort. And on one of his little trips down south, I'll show you y'all know what the United States looks like, but that's a long ways to go. He took a horse and he went all the way down. I don't know if he was pulling wagons, probably not, because the roads were terrible. And the year, it was 1856 or something like that. But anyways, don't quote me on that. He goes down and he's bringing up 49 horses and mules. And there was a lot of, the Spaniards had a lot of, San Diego, there was a lot of livestock down there. Up here in the new country, almost nothing, So where do we get our livestock? We had to go all the way down and drive cattle or whatever we could find, back up all the way through the valley, up over the Siskiyous, and up in here to Oregon. So Joel did that quite often, Joel Perkins. In fact, he even was trying to name a town after himself which became Grants Pass, but he was calling it Perkinsville. It didn't stick. But what did happen in that area was pretty tragic. And so his young wife, you know, we don't know the motives. We can't, I don't want to speak ill of the Hahn family either, you know. But what transpired was some kind of affair or attraction to the only cattle hand that Joel Perkins had on this journey, and it was John Malone. Well, they start batting eyes at each other and growing fond of each other of some sort. There was even some kids that said they had heard Laura and John talking about a way to like off Joel, kill him. That's probably unsubstantiated, and I can't, you know, where's the evidence to that? But what did happen was, in a drunken, it wasn't even a brawl. Joel was walking away from John and he shot him. But John had enough life left in him to turn around, and he got one shot off, and it glanced John in the cheek, didn't hurt him. He takes the butt end of his rifle and he like basically cades in Joel Perkins' head with the butt end of the rifle. And Joel Perkins says, you know, begging for mercy, you know, I've got 2 kids to support and a wife, you know. And John Malone just dropped the rifle and was like, I can't do it. He left him there dying, and he did die. And through circumstantial conversations and things led back to Laura and John Malone, who was Joel's cattle hand. So now we find those 2 incarcerated in the Jackson County Jail, Jacksonville. And basically, there's also another part of the story where when they ran down and they found John Malone, they said, hey, we know you did it. They threw a rope over a limb and they said, we might as well just hang you right here. Just confess to it, because we know that you killed Joel Perkins. And then he was denying it, and Laura said, he did it. I'll tell you where the body is, led him to it. And so Laura was off the hook. There wasn't enough evidence to say that she was an accomplice. And so while John Malone is in the jail in Jacksonville, he hangs himself with his own jail chains that are keeping him in the cell. So he left the world. He's gone. He can't talk. They can't interrogate him. Laura Hahn gets picked up by her dad, Jacob Hahn. He came down to pick her up, and the little boy, they had 2 kids at the time, and they got him back to the Yamhill County area. And then after that, the shame associated with the whole situation was really rough and hard on the Perkins family and the Hahn family. So if I recall correctly, so she went over towards Hermiston or Eastern Oregon and lived it out the rest of her days. And so that was the story behind Joel Perkins. And it was a pretty rough one. And actually, let's see, we have, what's this here? I'll just read it. Any doubt that Richard Marple's guilt was erased in 1899. Okay, now we're stepping back to the, maybe I won't read it because this is actually going to confuse you. This is back to that Lafayette story about the storekeeper of the movie that we watched. But I do have something more to add to that. They talk about the witch that is screaming, you know, go home or something in the Lafayette Minor Cemetery, which is pretty amazing because I think maybe Anna Marple is like a good ventriloquist because she's not buried there. She's buried in Southern Oregon somewhere. With her boy Richard, who they call Gus. So I don't know about that. And there's talk about a hanging tree. I mean, I read something about a hanging tree that would have been in the center of the park over from Bill's Market, that little softball field. There was a heritage oak tree there that they sometimes referenced as a hanging tree. Don't hang me for saying that because I could be wrong, but I do know that they had built a gallows next to the courthouse that they hung Richard Marple on. They took him out of the 2nd-story window, and he was mouthing off a lot, the Richard Marple guy who killed the storekeeper Corker. And at some point, they had said that he had turned his head and the rope slipped up to his chin, and that's why he suffocated. He didn't get a clean break. Because you need to have the rope down where it's going to break your neck, so it's an instant death. That's why that went on for 18 minutes. But there's a high cost to run your mouth, you know, and unfortunately, it was 18 minutes of misery while all the townspeople gathered and watched it in horror. And, but do I believe that the town was burnt because she said it's gonna burn? Well, I don't. Makes a great film though, but, anyway, that's a wrap for what I have here. And, I think Heather had a few things she wanted to share, and we can do some questions and answers, right? If you have questions, hopefully I have answers. Anybody, anything stand out? Anything that you're just dying to know that I just didn't cover? Anybody sleeping out here and you can't even hear me talking right now? Oh, good. He's a plant. We planted him in the audience to ask questions.
John Malone, is he of the Malone family, like the Malone Cemetery here in McMinnville? Do you know that?
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, I mean,
That's easy. When I don't know it, I don't have to make stuff up. Kinda good.
you could do it.
Yes, John.
Why was the mother not charged, since the film said that she supplied the sleeping powder or whatever it was?
Well, circumstantially, I would guess because she moved out of the area quickly. And the story that was drawn from this was that's one thing I actually didn't mention. But they did mention it in the film. They talked about the inmate that was with Richard Marple in the cell. Heard recounting the whole story about how they did it and everything, because that was a lot of detail. Also, Richard Marple, being the arrogant turd that he was, he was bragging about other people he'd murdered and other things he had done. So, I mean, maybe it's two birds with one stone there. I don't know. Anybody else? Oh, yeah,
Yeah, where is the Malone Cemetery?
that's another good question.
That is right next to Wilco. Okay.
Oh, of course, and I used to mow that one too. But is it even labeled?
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
See, I'm learning stuff too as we go.
I have a comment.
Yes.
I love to go to cemeteries, especially really old ones,
Mhm.
and went to one recently. And I know everybody knows this is, it's usually the husband's name and then the wife says wife of,
Mhm.
so it said Margaret, wife of Reverend so-and-so. And all it said was she had done what she could. And I thought that was so.
Wow, it's so big.
She had done what she could.
A lot of times they'll say aged to 20 years or something like that. I kind of had an interesting experience in that Malone Cemetery now that I know the name of it is. Because I was about 25 years ago mowing that thing in front of Wilco, and a lot of the stones had gotten covered with sod. And it was just kind of an interesting experience. Took my buddy and I out, just scraping off the stone. It's like, you think, man, how long since anybody's even taken the effort to even figure out who's here, out of respect. It's just so forgotten. In fact, what I do know about the Malone Cemetery is I didn't even know it was there until the co-op or something. I don't know if it was there's a drive-in theater that used to be in the back of that area. But it was actually discovered under a bunch of blackberries or something. When, I can't tell you, I don't know when that was discovered, but it's definitely an old pioneer cemetery. Anybody else? Pam, do you have questions?
No, I have a couple of comments
Oh,
about cemeteries. though.
okay.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Oh, one more thing about cemeteries. One thing that's interesting is if you're in a mining town or a place where there's a lot of men and not a lot of women, a lot of times the pastor or the preacher in the area was called a marrying and burying preacher.
Ooh.
Consequently, there really wasn't anybody to marry. But most people in those areas died with their boots on. And so they called the cemeteries the boot hill.
Oh.
And it was quite unfortunate to die in their boots because it meant you were working and you didn't live to a long old age. And yeah, there was a lot of deaths in the woods, logging, but more so where the boot hills would have been referenced would have been in the mining camp areas. Back over out of Baker City, there's a town called Auburn. It was one of the largest towns in Eastern Oregon at the time because of the gold. And there's literally a dot on the map, and I drove my poor wife all the way out. I don't know how many miles of logging roads. We found this cemetery. There's about half a dozen or 10 stones left. And that's the only thing left. You can see gratings where buildings were, and I know this has nothing to do with Yano County, but they had a cemetery, and that most certainly would have been a boot hill. So, not very many females in town, very, very sad. So,
One more back here.
oh, yes,
Again, not a Yamhill County, but if you're traveling from Reno down to Las Vegas and you go through Tonopah.
yes.
Tonopah was a huge mining town and their cemetery is the most interesting thing to walk through.
Hmm,
You can tell when parts of the mine collapsed. Also when plagues went through town, because there's just all of a sudden a whole bunch of gravestones with a certain date. And it's all the same date for everybody there. It's really interesting.
I went through the gold mine, that's on the hill just out of Tonopah. And by the way, if you're ever going through that town, they have the best hamburger at that motel. That's,
Okay.
yeah, wow, it was a really good hamburger, and I'm gonna brag about it. That was just this last year, so they're probably still good if you go there.
It was a really cool.
Thank you, Kory, for your help.